in South Africa we have a term called coconut, and that's usually, you know how a coconut is brown on the outside and white on the inside. So there's a generation of black young women or young men that call themselves coconut. Those of us who were private school education, they sometimes refer to themselves as coconut because black on the outside, white on the inside. We were exposed to, our parents invested a lot of energy in protecting us from apartheid and what happened during those days. And I think from my husband's story, he was right in the middle of that. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for him, his parents didn't protect him from that. Hence, I say his story might be a lot more interesting than mine. Hence, my opportunity to go to the States as well also falls in. That was my parents then taking me out of what was probably happening back then, just to give more exposure, because at that stage, well, it wasn't even too long ago, it was in 2000, I think, when I left for America. I got the Mandela Students Scholarship to go study there, did my undergraduate in psychology. And I think at that point, my mom just wanted to give me, my parents wanted to just give me more exposure, because things were still very closed up in South Africa. University was difficult to get into back then, things like that. So my mom was just like, just go. Or probably because I was a bit of a rebel in my life. That's probably one of the other reasons why she just sent me out there. But nonetheless, the experience was overwhelming, living in America by myself, being an international student, which is a huge thing for me. I came back to South Africa and I became the biggest advocate for international students. I think your country does a very good job at looking after international students, which is something that is extremely lacking in our universities. We don't even do it half as well for that. So that's something that I really just want you to go back and just tell the International Students Office that they're doing a brilliant job. If I had to just compare, and I'm constantly telling them this side, you need to go out overseas and benchmark and see what these other universities overseas are doing for international students. That's a big thing for me. I only got to realize half of the things that were happening in South Africa when I was out of it. I had to leave the country to see it because I was living in a totally different world, like I say. While everything was happening around, secretly, out in the open, I was too busy just being me in a private school amongst white girls. I went to girls' school, just doing my thing, not really bothered about what the rest of the country is going on. And that was basically my life. So I only actually got to start thinking about it and realizing it when I was out of the country. And then it's a spectator's point of view. You are outside South Africa, you're hearing about it, you want to know more about what's happening in your country, so you start investing energy when you're out of that context. So a lot of the things I only actually got to understand. I remember sitting in a African, I can't remember what that module was called, African Studies class in Columbia, and one of the topics on one of the lessons was about apartheid and the Anglo-Boer War, and I was shocked at myself that I actually only got to start thinking about it when I was there. And then I was being taught by an American. Then I had to actually go and call my parents, get them to send me information and start thinking about it, and I was like, oh no. Came back and I said to the lecturer, no, you have it all wrong. So she eventually gave me an opportunity to actually speak more about it, and that was the very first time I began to integrate it inside of me, in my life as well. So that was a huge eye-opener for me. Then 9/11 happened, which is something I haven't really told anybody about. I'm stuck in the train for about 3 hours. I was 3 blocks from the Twin Towers. And another thing, when I keep thinking back to why I had to be there at that time, I got into that system where I had to redo English because apparently English that I spoke was a bit different. So I attended remedial English courses downtown, a college downtown. So once a week I would travel down to one of the colleges there. I can't remember what it was called, and that's how I ended up there. And that was also something else that made me think about who I am, where I come from. I think life flashes in front of you, and you think to yourself, oh gosh, I'm almost gone. And then you start thinking about where you come from, who you are. And my whole life changed from then. South Africa, for me, became a totally different place. And that all happened when I was out of the country. So I came back to South Africa, and I invested a lot of energy in finding out, in learning a bit more. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had happened. That was only then when I went back and I read about it and I thought about it. Do I agree? Do I disagree? Because I've always thought my calling was teaching, not the conventional form of teaching, and I think this is what I do. This is where I actually integrate psychology with my teaching, because I sit with a client in front of me, with a patient in front of me, and I feel like I am teaching. Hence, I've always believed that my calling is teaching. I've always paid attention to the education system as well in South Africa and compared it, because I wasn't educated here. I only came in and did my master's here. My high school, primary school was obviously the private schools. Then I did 1 year at Rhodes, and then the scholarship came through, and then I was gone. So I actually, in terms of higher education, I never had it here. So I'm constantly thinking about it and thinking about ways to exchange, because that system overseas, I learned a lot from there. It worked to a certain extent for me. It was simple. I never thought I'd make the dean's list, but I did. And in South Africa, it's extremely difficult to even just make anything at university. Most of the students here just go through and just pass. If I get a 50, I'm good to go. And that's how they function in our universities. So I started paying attention to the dynamics of the universities in South Africa, which then taught me, if I may use the word segregation, to a certain extent, I realized that, I was telling my husband in the car as well, there's still a huge element of segregation happening in our country. And it's probably because of the different cultures that we have in South Africa, the 11 official languages that we have. It makes it a bit difficult. We've got English and Afrikaans classes. Most of the Afrikaans students will attend Afrikaans classes. They get the chance to be taught in their home language, and everybody else suffers and they get taught in a second language. So there are elements and symptoms of segregation happening in our education system. Private schools are getting better education, more benefits, easier entry level into universities, and our public schools are suffering. So there's huge, and this is what I've been thinking about recently, and just thinking about how to change it. My PhD is aligned in that direction as well, in terms of how do we then cultivate, develop our public education system, because it's not working, and most people, majority of South Africans, can only afford public school education. You spoke about suffering. Are there any questions so far? Any questions? Nothing. If I had to think of the suffering in the country, gosh, I think my husband must say something there about suffering. I'm even too scared to say I wasn't really exposed to any suffering in the country. I hear of it. I've spoken a lot to a lot of elders, my family members. They told me about it. I remember when my husband first told me his story, I almost cried. Can I share something? Okay. My husband comes from a very disadvantaged background. I want you to think about the differences between him and myself. I went straight from high school straight into university, and then the opportunity to go overseas came. My husband matriculated, and then he spent about 5-6 years where he couldn't go to school, couldn't do anything. He did everything. He applied, but there was just no opportunities. So it was a totally different world for him. He worked as a gardener for one of Terbulance's soldiers. And he opened a little tuck shop. What's a tuck shop? A little shop thing where he actually just had to make a living and help the family out. And then one day, an advert was in the newspaper about, in South Africa we've got a program where we train with some of our students go to Cuba and they go to medical school there. There's a affiliation with Cuban universities that side. So an advert came out in the newspaper. It was found by the owner of the house, the owner's wife, who passed it on to the maid that was cleaning in the house, and the maid gave it to him to go and apply because she just felt that he was a better candidate for this than her own son. Passed it on to him, she applied, and even then that took 2 years to get a response, and by the time he got the response, he went to Cuba and went to medical school, and that's how his medical career actually began. He never once thought he wanted to be a doctor. Whenever he applied for schooling, it was for law. He wanted to be a lawyer, and I guess God had another plan for him. And he ended up in Cuba as a result. In Spanish people, my husband is fluent in Spanish. That's one of the conditions that they do when they study medical. They do 1 year of medical school there. And here he is today, a medical doctor. So that's why I say his story is completely different. Two different worlds, if you listen to them as well. The hardships that he went through, I know nothing about. And I always tell him what he experienced was what my parents experienced. So he's my generation, but he's still lived like my parents' generations did back in their days. Here's the two different worlds. So now he's doing exactly what my parents did. He is investing a lot of energy in providing, in making sure that one day when we have kids, they get a whole better lifestyle, which is what my parents did for me, and I guess I was fortunate in that part. So in terms of suffering, I have secondhand experience from it. It's important for me, from where I come from, and from the few people that I've spoken to, it's important to understand what it was that they were going through at that time, the context of the time when most of the sufferings happened. I think even now, even today, South Africa's got other challenges that have hit us, ranging from HIV/AIDS to children being raped, to policemen being targeted, to communities taking the law into their own hands. It's coming at us in many, many different forms. And most of them are politically affiliated as well. So it's always important to understand the context of where one's coming at. A lot of communities are in a riot right now because service deliveries, basic services in communities aren't happening. So the communities are up in a roar, they're rioting, they are causing towns and cities to a standstill. I mean, if you think of Joburg and you think of a highway that's been blocked by taxi drivers that don't want to pay the toll gate fees, to pay back the money that built those highways. So the context, one can't help but consider the context people are coming from. It's too easy to just say, you're making a mess, you're causing chaos, our lives are coming to a standstill. It's important to also think about where these people are coming from and how the changes or the lack of service deliveries. I just want to say something. If you listen to the way my husband speaks about his background and then connects it to the way life is for him now, it's still very similar to the way it was back then when he was still growing up as a young boy. And I think every time I listen to him speak, I read once, I think I was reading a newspaper, I was reading something, and it said segregation, it said discrimination against a discriminator is still discrimination. Which is something that I think I'm still on a mission, trying to slowly creep into his life. Because sometimes when he speaks, it does come through. And his experiences with amongst white South Africans, my experiences amongst white South Africans are totally different. Hence, I can say something like that, like discrimination against a discriminator is still discrimination, which is something for him, considering his context and where he's coming from, becomes something totally different. Because there are many days where he does come home and he's frustrated and he is mad. And you've got to bring him down, but understand where he's coming from. It's too easy to just agree with him, which is what I find that sometimes society in South Africa expects us to just agree. You have black people who are exposed to all the suffering directly, first-hand exposure, and then you have some of us who know it from second-hand, but we can't really relate to it as much, and we're trying to strike a balance. So there's constantly conflict, even amongst our own people, trying to strike that common ground where some of us have got the experience and some of us actually don't have the experience. We just hear about it. But that's been my lesson, because I came back from the States. I got to University of the Free State, which was a predominantly Afrikaans university. And I landed up in the Free State when there was a lot of change, uproar. Students were in uproar, fighting the language of instruction, fighting the management of the university. And eventually we got Professor Jonathan Jansen, and he seems to have turned things around. And while I was still getting used to that new setting where everybody was working together, it seemed to be going okay. Then I got landed up at the University of Potchefstroom, which is an even worse environment the University of the Free State was. And in the University of Potchefstroom, I'm now constantly reminding myself, because I think a lot of things that happened there are a lot harsher than they did at University of the Free State. The other day, I was sitting outside on a bench having lunch and watching the students walk around, and I could count the number of black students walking around the campus. There were so few. And for me, that was like a huge shock, because this is not supposed to be happening. We are, 15 years into democracy and 18 years into democracy, and we still have campuses that are predominantly white, Afrikaans speaking. It was quite a shock for me, and I just thought to myself, I just came from a Free State where the students just cause an uproar, and now I'm here again. Just what I'm supposed to be enjoying something, now I've landed up in the same situation, even worse. And I'm constantly having to remind even the students that because their parents or their grandparents discriminated against your parents, if you begin discriminating against them now, it's still discrimination. What you're doing is still wrong. What you're doing is still against Mandela's word. Because when Mandela came out, that's what he was saying. He said everybody will be equal, we will forgive everybody. So we need to if we want to keep that going, then we need to start thinking about it. Because if we start doing the opposite, or even just think like we're fighting for our rights, we're doing totally opposite to what Mandela wanted us to do, or his message to all of us and the generations to come. We're getting it all wrong. Any questions?
I have a question. Do you did you or do you ever feel like guilty that you had the advantage of going to a private school, and then like on the other end, do you find that people who weren't as privileged as you feel maybe like resentful or anything towards you?
I don't think I felt guilty. I think after I met my husband, I felt bad. It wasn't a guilt as such. It was just like what was I doing? Because when I asked him the age he was at that time, I can't help but think, what was I doing when I was that age? That was the least of my worries. I just felt bad, that I was somewhere walking this earth, just having the time of my life, and on the other side, somebody probably the same age as myself was going through something totally different. So it just made you feel bad. I don't think I felt guilty about it, because I know to a certain extent my parents went through the same thing as well. So I just felt bad that when I was just doing this, somebody else was doing something else, which is why now I'm constantly having to reflect. Hence my experiences in America were so good for me, because I really, really got that spectators. I got to look at South Africa from a whole different perspective. And I got to see things that I probably wouldn't have noticed if I was here. I probably wouldn't have even paid attention to if I was here.
I think that if I can come here and as a fellow South African, because this is one thing that I've, during the past few days, picked up again, that there's, I don't know if it's a new form of classism, or, that's moving away from racism, but there's different things that separate. We find new ways of getting groups together to separate from each other. You understand what I mean? And we were so good in the past to do it that we now glide from one into the other, very easily, without reflecting on what's really happening. So socially, I think the old type of of harsh discrimination is still very much alive. But what you guys are saying now is very true. You know that there's a move towards finding new ways of discriminating instead of and that's why my theme is around this whole thing of suffering. There's just a lot of people. Kevin has an article that somebody gave him about the statistics of children in South Africa, and there may be a lot of other minority groups or groups that suffer in South Africa, and I think in this whole process of getting us some new things to discriminate about, those things are still not growing better. Is it true or not? What I'm trying to say is, I'm sure we have moved a long way away from apartheid, but in the practical sense of the word, did we?
I think we moved away from the concept of the black and white thing.
Yeah.
But the whole groups thing is so ingrained in us that we're now just moving along. And as we move, we form the little groups. Like you're right to say, we have new reasons to now be in a particular group or community. That's why I say it's tribalism as well. It's definitely tribalism as well. Because if you go down to KwaZulu-Natal, it was just recently when we were down in Durban, and I went to high school in Durban. I remember I hated Durban because every single black person there expected every other black person to speak Zulu. And I've always said that Zulus don't have the concept that there are other black people in this country that don't speak Zulu. So they walk around the country speaking Zulu to everybody. You know, and if you don't speak Zulu, then you're a bad person, you know, type of thing. So it comes into our cultures as well.
I think for long in my life, I thought that, changing the world is a big thing, and changing things and systems are big, and therefore it is people with power and people who work for power and, you know, people in powerful positions that can change systems and the world and all those things. I think the past 2 or 3 years, I've come to a certain conclusion, and that is, I have to, as a person, as the person who I am, have to decide for me and for myself how I'm going to be a person. And I can be in Russia, or I can be in China, or I can be whatever. The context definitely have an influence on my choice, but I must make a decision. You know, who am I? And it's more than a identity question. It is more of how am I going to be proactive to make the fact that I lived a difference in the world. And I don't mean by the money that I leave or the children that I have, maybe in the children and the other people, but and then I've started by saying, actually, you know, there are a few very simple things that I can do immediately. And it doesn't necessarily has a faith background, which is my background, the theological background. It is because I was fighting the church and the traditional Christian faith belief, and I'm fighting it still at this moment. That they come to the solution that, you know, God is reigning this world, and if I say I am standing in His shadow and I'm following Him, I have also then make a decision how I am going to be human. What does my humaneness mean for me? And there are a few things that I can say these things I've tried and I can see that I succeed with it. Simple things like I always introduce people by their name and by their surname. When doesn't matter what background are you for. Are you Maria Mofokeng, who is washing our floor, and I bring in students, family who come and visit the house. I also, this is Maria Mofokeng, and this is Dirk. Is Maria is from Ikageng, and Dirk is from. And then I stand and wait till they meet, straight up, because people doesn't want to make even eye contact. That's for one thing. So I think there are a lot of humanist things that we have to turn back to as people in South Africa, because you won't trust people and you won't trust other people if you don't have that basics, flowing again in the society. I think there's a superficial way in South Africa that's worrying me, and that is when you have two white businessmen sitting and ordering coffee and waiting for the two black colleagues in the same company to come and to listen to how they talk about the company and what they're now going to talk about. And then when the real thing happened, there's a dishonesty going on, and the opposite also. I think we must be, in the sense of decisions that we make about our humanities, start being really, really very honest. And if I have difficulty with something, say it or try to work it out. And then there are things that I think, and it was Professor, what's his last name? Your professor at Michael Tamani, that said, why do you think you can't go to politicians? Why don't you think you can do the? Because I said I believe that the best way to do in South Africa is if I go to the bank and I say I want to buy a house, I want a bond for $1 million, the bank will say immediately Mr. Kitching goes with it, a bond of 1,100,000. That 100,000 is for another person's house. You can't get $1 million. If you can't get $1 million, 100,000. We will introduce you to that couple, but you, with that couple, in a certain way, are going to build 2 houses, and you are responsible for a lot. I am willing to pay an extra 100,000 on my bond per month if I know I build a house for somebody, and I've already did it in Ikageng, but I'm not willing to put it somewhere in a coffer where it disappears, and that we've talked about it. So there's a new NGO role, a new role for NGOs who can be the sort of buffer. Does it make sense? Okay, but I think my hope is that when you go back to the States, you will also start looking for those liminal spaces of discomfort where you can grow, and that is where it's important to be when it comes to being humane, is to be uncomfortable. As soon as you become comfortable, you must start worrying, because then you're not in the right space. Your position are not good. And she's a psychologist, you could say, Deon, it's because you have problems with yourself or you are in your medicine.
Well, I think your autonomy is important. I think your understanding your own individuality and what it's comprised of is the start. And then anything external, your individuality would be things that are internal, and your autonomy as well, but anything external that you even think has a possibility of adding on to the definition of who you are, I think it's important to begin to integrate it as well. Because if I think of myself, I never integrated my queerness, my Tswana, my South African, and the minute I did that, then I'm at peace now. I can almost deal with a lot of things. I think in the country, I can still leave the country and still come back and say I'm a South African and have all these pointed questions being thrown in my face. But I think it's because I've now learned to integrate it in my life. I mean, I was born and raised Methodist, and I remember when I went to America, I wasn't a Methodist. I'd left the church. It was just driving me nuts. And that's one of the other things that I came back and I was like, this is something that I want to also integrate in me. Just make it a part of me. What I didn't know about the various aspects that I felt could make up me, I went out and I found out more about them. Hence, the culture of South Africa, the issues in South Africa, I had to read about them, to find out about them first to actually understand, instead of just turning a blind eye to them as well. I think that would be my message to you, is going back and whatever it is that, like Deon said, made you uncomfortable. Find out why and see where it fits in. Because chances are it probably does form a part of you and it makes you uncomfortable. That's my lesson that I learned when I came back from the States and I came back home. It really, really